Imagine you're a merchant. You're on one of the most profitable trading operations in Europe. Your family's been Christian for 2 generations, baptized, church-going, the lot. But last week, your neighbor was dragged from his house at dawn. Someone decided that his grandmother was Jewish. They seized his warehouse, his ships, his home, everything. And now everyone's looking at you. Not because you've done anything wrong, because someone somewhere might remember your grandfather's name. Stay in the country you were born in and risk losing everything to a tribunal that needs 0 evidence to get rid of you. They just need a mere suspicion. Or leave. Take your money, your contacts, your expertise, and get out. Go to Antwerp, go to Amsterdam, go anywhere that will buy what you're selling. This wasn't Nazi Germany in the 1930s. This was Portugal in the 1540s. Hundreds of families had to make that calculation. And when they left, and it was a when, not an if, they didn't just take their expertise and savings. They took the commercial infrastructure of an empire with them. This is the story of how Portugal designed a system designed to purify itself. And in the process, it made Amsterdam rich. To understand why Portugal destroyed its empire, you first have to understand why they did what they did. Why they thought it was a good idea. By the early 1500s, Portugal was punching way above its weight. A country of maybe 1.5 million people had trading posts from Macau to Brazil. Lisbon was one of the richest ports in Europe. Spices, gold, sugar, slaves, all flowing through a previously small city on the edge of the Atlantic. Now, in theory, being a small country running an empire, that should mean everyone gets rich, right? And that's kind of what's happening. But the problem with it is you're stretched a bit thin. The crown, the church, the old aristocracy, they control all the administration, all the military infrastructure. But the commercial engine, the trade hub of the empire, was increasingly being run by merchants who happened to be new Christian, conversos, Jewish families who had converted, often forcibly, in the 1490s. But these families didn't just trade. The family itself was the trade network. They had family connections in the Ottoman Empire, in the Low Countries, in India, everywhere. They understood credit, risk, long-distance finance. In many, many ways, they were the heart of the Portuguese Empire. But that made certain people very uncomfortable. The crown owed money. The old Christian nobility resented the new wealth of the new Christian. The church wanted religious uniformity. And in 1536, Portugal got its Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Now, if we're being generous and strong-manning their argument, you can kind of see the logic if you squint hard enough. You've got an economically powerful, socially distinct group of people who you're not entirely sure of the loyalty of. And the Inquisition gives you a great tool to get around that. You investigate them, and when they're found guilty, you confiscate their property, you redistribute that to yourself and the people that are close to you, the church and the nobility. And on top of that, the purity of blood laws, which were another level on top of the Inquisition itself, limpeza de sangue, lock them out of every institution that matters. By 1588, new Christians were officially excluded from any religious, administrative, or military posts. By 1623, the ban extended to university teaching, law, and medicine. You couldn't be a doctor, you couldn't be a teacher, you couldn't hold public office, and not even because of what you believed, but what your grandparents believed. And from the inside, every one of those moves seems to make sense. The church gets orthodoxy. The crown gets wealth. Confiscated wealth, but wealth nonetheless. The old aristocracy gets rid of its competition. Everyone who mattered, or at least everyone with power anyway, got what they wanted. The problem is what happened next. And what happened is the people that Portugal squeezed the hardest were the people holding the finances of the empire together. So what does it feel like to be inside this system? Let's make it feel real. Let's make it concrete. You're a new Christian merchant in Lisbon around 1600. Your family converted over a century ago. You go to mass every week. Your children are baptized. But that doesn't matter because the Inquisition doesn't care about your faith. It cares about your blood. The way that enforcement worked was almost bureaucratic, systematic in its cruelty. If you wanted any important position, a seat in a religious brotherhood, a place at a university, entry to a military order, there was always an inquiry. Witnesses were called and they testified under oath about not your character, not your beliefs, your ancestry. And the burden of proof was on you. You had to prove the negative. You had to prove there were no Jewish or Moorish ancestors in your family tree. By 1618, even the Misericordias, the charitable brotherhoods that ran hospitals and gave to the poor, required purity of blood. By 1604, the military orders banned any kind of special exemption. No exceptions, no appeals. And then there was the Inquisition itself. Over 36,000 cases were handled between 1540 and 1765. Around 1,500 people were sentenced to death. But that wasn't the main weapon. The main weapon was confiscation. If you were investigated, even if you were eventually cleared, it could ruin you. Your assets frozen. Your reputation destroyed. Your business contacts suddenly very reluctant to do business with you. You're sitting in Lisbon and doing the maths in your head. You stay, keep your head down, and hope no one denounces you. But you can't send your son to university. You can't become politically active. There's no institution you could join that will protect your family's status. And at any moment, a tribunal could come along and take everything from you. Or you can leave. And this is the critical thing. Leaving wasn't just possible. It was easy. Everyone in Europe wanted what you had. Your trade network, your expertise, your international finance. It was so much easier to move than it was to fight against what you had to face in Portugal. Every rival port in Europe wanted exactly what you had. Amsterdam wanted your money. Antwerp wanted your trade networks. London wanted your expertise. You weren't a refugee begging for entry. You were a prize. The sources make it very clear. Many of the most enterprising New Christian entrepreneurs and merchants escaped abroad, taking their energy, enterprise, and capital to Amsterdam, Antwerp, London, Rouen, Leghorn. And they didn't leave because they were disloyal. They left because Portugal made loyalty irrational. But here's where it gets worse. The people who were left behind knew exactly what was happening, but they couldn't do anything about it. The effects of this weren't a slow, invisible bleed. People saw it. They said it, out loud and in writing, to the crown itself, and it changed nothing. As early as 1552, so just 16 years after the Inquisition was started, a crown official wrote to the Queen of Portugal with a warning. In Goa, their Indian trading post, the aggressive conversion tactics of the Jesuits were causing Hindu labourers and merchants to flee. They weren't warning about this from a religious point of view. It was purely practical. Portuguese Christians in the colony couldn't live, couldn't work, couldn't make money. The colony itself without them. In 1561, the head of the Jesuits, Antonio de Quadros, admitted that the average Portuguese person and even crown officials in Goa were furious about the conversion tactics being used. Why? Because they relied on local expertise to keep the colony going, to make the financial administration work. The people running the money with the people being driven away. During the viceroyalty of Dom Constantino de Bragança in the late 1550s, crown officials officially protested that converting Banyan merchants was causing a reduced revenue for the crown. It was hitting them where it hurts. They weren't defending religious tolerance. They were defending the tax base. And this pattern repeats for almost 200 years, 2 centuries. In 1736, the diplomat Don Luis de Cunha wrote a direct criticism of the institution's practices, arguing that they were driving the New Christians straight into the arms of London and Amsterdam. So the information was there for centuries. The diagnosis was clear. The people closest to the economic machine were warning that everything was grinding to a halt. But who would need to act on that information to change anything? Which was receiving the confiscated property. So for now, everything was fine. The church, which was getting the orthodoxy it wanted, and the power it craved, and the old Christian aristocracy, which had eliminated its greatest rival. Every single group that could have reversed the policy was benefiting from it. So the Inquisition wasn't really a bug in the system. It was really a feature, at least for the people that benefited from it, for now. The feedback loop wasn't being blocked by ignorance. It was being blocked by interest. The people with the information didn't have the power, and the people with the power didn't have the incentive. That's not really a policy failure as such. It's a structural trap. And while Portugal was in the middle of this trap, its rivals were doing something amazing with Portuguese talent and money. And this is the part that should sting if you're thinking about it from Portugal's perspective. Portugal didn't just lose people, it grew its own competitors. When new Christian merchants arrived in Amsterdam, they didn't just turn up empty-handed. They arrived with capital, with established contacts across the Portuguese Empire, with knowledge of markets in Brazil, West Africa, and the Indian Ocean. They spoke the languages. They knew the routes. They understood the credit system. And the Dutch were more than happy to put all of that to use. And it's very clear looking back that these refugees enriched Amsterdam and other ports around Europe. The Jews of London, many of them refugees from the Portuguese Inquisition, became major dealers in woolen goods. But let's not forget, England was one of the first to expel its Jews over a century before the Portuguese and Spanish Inquisitions. So they're not completely off the hook, they just got their timing right. In city after city, the commercial talent that Portugal had effectively expelled became the heart of the financial hubs around the world. And think about what that means in practice. A merchant who last year was financing a sugar shipment from Brazil to Portugal is now doing the same, but to Amsterdam. The same knowledge, the same contacts, the same capital. Just a different flag. Trade in this era didn't run on institutions like it does now, although maybe that's about to end. It ran on trust. It ran on family connections, on personal relationships built up over decades. When a merchant family relocated from Lisbon to Amsterdam, they didn't sever those connections. They moved them over. They redirected them. The network that once served Portugal now served the Dutch Republic, because that's where the money was. Portugal had spent a century building the most extensive trade network in the world. Then it systematically expelled the people that operated it. This is what makes the purity of blood statutes so devastating. They were an accidental knowledge transfer program. Portugal took its most commercially sophisticated population and handed them fully formed to the rival ports all over Europe. Amsterdam and London didn't need to train these people. They just needed to not prosecute them. But the statutes didn't stop there. They got worse. You'd think after a few decades of obvious economic damage, the laws might be weakened or stripped away. But if anything, they got worse. They did the opposite. The timeline is almost methodical in its escalation. In 1588, new Christians are banned from working in religious orders, in the military, in the government, as we've seen. 1604, as we've seen. The military orders can't give exceptions to the new Christian. 1618, the charitable brotherhoods require purity of blood as well. 1623, universities, medicine and law all added to the ban. 1671, new legislation that tightens the rules, that prevents anyone with Jewish, Moorish or mulatto blood from holding any office. And it didn't just stay contained in Portugal, it spread like a virus all through the empire. In 1707 and 1719, the synodal institutions of Bahia in Brazil prohibited the ordination of anyone, and I'm quoting here, with stains of Jew, Moor, Morisco, mulatto, heretic, or any other race disallowed as contaminated. By 1763, the Third Order of St. Francis in Minas Gerais in Brazil required members to be of legitimate white birth, without Jewish, Moorish, or mulatto blood. Each new law and restriction created new beneficiaries. Each new exclusion gave someone a competitive advantage they didn't want to give up. A mediocre old Christian lawyer who gets his position because the new Christian lawyer was barred isn't going to give that advantage up, is he? He isn't going to lobby for reform. He's going to lobby for more restriction. This is why the system couldn't self-correct. Every exclusion created a new group who wanted more exclusions. They wanted to draw the ladder up. The statutes weren't maintained by ideology alone. They were maintained by the material interests of everyone who had gained something from them, because a more qualified competitor had been removed from the game. The ratchet and pressure only turned one way. So what did Portugal actually look like after 2 centuries of this? By the 1700s, it was obvious to everyone that Portugal had eaten its own empire. The commercial class that had enriched Portugal and powered its empire was scattered around Europe, enriching everybody else but them. The institutions that should have powered Portugal's next doctors, lawyers, politicians were filtering candidates not by ability but by ancestry. The Inquisition had processed over 36,000 cases, creating a permanent atmosphere of suspicion that made long-term investment very unattractive, especially if you might come under suspicion one day yourself. And here's the final irony. The wealth confiscated from the new Christians, the short-term payoff that made the whole thing attractive to the crown, was just a fraction of the taxes and other benefits they would have generated if those families had stayed. Portugal traded a river for a bucket. Dom Luis da Cunha in 1736 saw it very clearly. He wrote that the procedures of the Inquisition were driving talented people all around Europe away from Portugal. But by then it had been happening for 200 years. The diagnosis was right, but it was way too late, because by then Amsterdam had the networks, London had the expertise, and Portugal had purity. Once Portugal created this system that relied on persecuting its most commercially vital population, the destruction of its commercial base was inevitable. Not necessarily because the people who ran the Inquisition were evil per se, but because every actor in the system, the crown, the church, the old aristocracy, the old Christian professionals that took the place of those new Christians, were all individually rewarded for doing something that was dismantling the empire they called their own. That's the thing about systems that require harm to function. They don't realize because someone realizes the harm. They collapse because there's nothing left to extract. And even though the likes of Amsterdam and London benefited from this, those powerful people in London weren't immune to doing the same things themselves. In Ireland during the 1640s in particular, they created an extractive system that relied on the cruelty and confiscation that we've seen here, and led to an inevitable backlash. Watch this to see how a blocked feedback loop in Ireland created a rebellion the British could barely contain. Bye!